Hope you all had a good break. We will get right into it. Mr. Rudel, a review of the March 2020-2021 financial report.
Should you bring up the memo? Can you hear us now?
We can.
Michelle, bring up the memo.
You just might need to speak up a bit.
Thank you. And this little page is just pulling up the memorandum in front of us. All right, so this is the financial report through March. We are currently projecting a year-end surplus of $1,146,836. This is an increase from a previous report of $870,350. So the large changes are we are changing our excess cost reimbursement forecast from 75% to 80.7. So that adds about 191,000. While this number is not finalized, we did reach out to the State Department and ask what their preliminary review is. They did send out a schedule saying at this point it's 80.7%. So while it's subject to change, we did increase the forecast to that 80.7%. We have disencumbered a little bit of money in legal fees. Tuition reimbursement will be slightly under budget by $8,700. As we mentioned at the last meeting, we are now reflecting the resignation of both program coordinators. The previous report only had one. Non-public out-of-district tuition is slightly higher at $18,000. We have disencumbered some funds for diesel fuel related to the buses. This is due to remote days and hybrid days for buses. This was done prior to the remote week for this week. So we would expect in the April report that number will probably increase slightly as well. We did have a couple of withdrawal of students in the LP. And then we will have a couple of transfers into the COVID budget, one for $11,145 for the vaccine clinic, custodial overtime of 20 is the forecasted deficit, and some slight increases in plexiglass at 2,800. The ESSER 2 grant is reflected in this for $596,805. A slight update to this. Thank you. A slight update to this: the State Department has approved this as a.
Rich, can I ask you to pause for a second? Michelle, can you scroll down on that screen? Just so everyone who's watching the meeting can follow along. Thank you.
So just a slight update: the State Department has approved the ESSER 2 grant over spring break, actually. So we are approved in the amount of $596,805. We have requested a drawdown of almost the entire amount of about $575,000. So we would expect to actually receive those funds in the next couple of weeks. Again, that grant is funding 3 elementary teachers, 1 technician, some facility improvements, PPEs, and technology-related items. The breakdown of the RCs, general education RCs, are a positive $402,286. Special education RCs are a positive $768,318. And again, that is primarily due to a higher reimbursement rate for excess costs. And then the reopening expenditures are forecasted at a negative $23,768, which would be addressed if the board approves the transfers highlighted. We'll go through some of the RCs. RC1, there really is no change. RC3, there is no change. RC5 and 7 are similar to the previous months and no change. RC8, 9 and 10 are similar to the previous months and no change. RC11, we do have the balance in transportation of $40,100, and interscholastic officials due to the short winter season of $25,000. RC12 is largely the same. We have filled the maintenance and custodial supervisors, so that balance of $20,000 remains favorable, as that is the time in which the position was vacant. RC13 remains the same, some savings due to clubs and councils. RC15 remains the same as the beginning of the year, with some slight savings in the copy center. RC16, I had mentioned, we did increase the balance, favorable balance of legal fees from $25,000 just over 35,000. We are looking at the trend every month, and the February bill was significantly lower than expected. RC 18 is pretty much the same. We are still flagging those contract support savings, which are the favorable contracts for our non-certified staff. As highlighted before, RC 19, we are reflecting the salary savings from the 2 vacant program coordinator positions. The reorganization, which has a director of elementary education, is expected now to be filled July 1st. So we would expect those savings to stay for the remainder of the year. RC 20 and 23 are the same. RC 24 are largely the same. I did highlight that there was a slight change in not in public tuition, out of district tuition. And then again, excess cost filing, while it's not finalized, the state did indicate to us a rate of 80.7%, which would be one of the highest rates in some time. While it's not final, we would expect to get the final number probably in a couple weeks, and then it would be reimbursed to us at the end of March or end of May. RC 25, regular transportation. We did flag this earlier, some savings in diesel fuel due to some remote sessions and hybrid sessions. This will likely increase because of the remote week this week. In addition, regular transportation will likely increase next month because, again, we have a remote week this week. Electricity, sewer, property insurance are all largely the same as the previous month. Health insurance remains the negative forecast of 65,000 as the previous month. RC 26, the one change is we did have a couple of withdrawals. So we lost some tuition, prorated tuition funds, and ELP tuition. Overall, we are again having a favorable balance of $1,146,836. If we move to the grant financial report, it's largely the same as previous months. We did highlight which grants are the 2-year grants versus 1-year grant. So the IDEA does expect to have a carryover of about $103,000. That is a 2-year grant. Title I, which is also a 2-year grant, anticipated to carry over just under $44,000. The Title II grant is also a 2-year grant, and we anticipate carrying over just over $40,000. Title III is also a 2-year grant, and we anticipate carrying over just over $7,700. And then Title IV is also a 2-year grant, and we anticipate carrying over $11,702. The ESSER grant has been received. The ESSER 2 grant, as I had mentioned, has been approved by the State Department, and we did submit for our drawdown for the month of May. The Coronavirus Relief Fund we've expended as well. The food service financial report, the month of March did have its strongest sales of the year. Revenue exceeded about $130,000 for the month, which was 110% higher than the next month. We would anticipate April being a much worse month. Again, we had a closure on April 5th of the high school and middle school, and then not reflected in here is the remote week for this week. We would anticipate probably losing at least $30,000 to $35,000 in revenue for this remote week. However, with some of the shifts that we made during the year, we still have at least a positive fund balance to end the year. We may or may not have to bring a transfer to the COVID account for some additional funding to support the lunch account, depending on how the rest of April plays out. But obviously, with a couple of remote days for the high school and middle school beginning, and then the remote week in April, plus the normal spring break week, we have less serving days in April than really any month in the year.
Tara, can you unmute? Or
Oh, sorry.
Thank you.
I'm just board questions.
I do have questions, but I don't know if you can see me.
No, we can. Go ahead, Mrs. Ritchie.
So I have a couple actually. I actually have more than a couple, but first of all, Rich, thank you for this detail. It's great. I just wanted to go over, obviously there was a significant change in terms of projected surplus for year end. And you give us good detail. I'm just missing about 20,000. So maybe that off the top of your head, you can, because I see that the difference is at about 276,000, but the list that you gave us is 256. So just wondering if off the top of your head, if there's a big number that jumps out that you could tell us about, or I can certainly back into it on my own.
So on the PowerPoint that's included in the packet, I think it's slide 5, you'll see that it changed from forecast of the prior month, which details out all the items. So it is the excess cost reimbursement of 191,000. Salary savings over and above the February report, which is 67,000. Diesel fuel 45. Some savings in materials, equipment, and travel 23. District legal fees over and above the previous month, which was 10,000. The tuition reimbursement 8,700. Workers' comp was about 1,300. Some salary, a negative 306. The COVID accounts that we had flagged for the plexiglass vaccine clinic and then the YMCA. The ELP tuition withdrawals, the out-of-district public tuition for 18,000, and then the custodial.
Okay, thanks. So you said that ESSER 2 grant has gone through, it's been approved, but we haven't submitted everything. When do you anticipate submitting the rest of those requests?
So we've submitted everything. You can only draw down expenditures plus a month forward.
Okay.
We drew down 575, and really the difference is the salaries related to the payments in June for the 4 employees that are in the grant. So since they haven't technically earned that money, we can't draw down that money yet.
Gotcha.
So next round of drawdowns, we draw down the full amount.
Okay.
One second, Deb.
Sure.
Deb, 1 second. Rich, can you just remind me on the deadline for spending the ESSER 2 grant?
It's September 2022.
Thank you. Go ahead, Mrs. Ritchie.
Sorry, I mean, anyone else can jump in if they want. I have a bunch of questions, so.
Okay, well, let's pause for 1 minute and I'll come back to you.
Sure.
Mr. Senior, Mrs. Parent, anything? Mrs. Parent, sorry, I saw Sarah first.
Can you give just a little more detail as to what the 11,000 for the COVID vaccine clinics, like, is that solely to pay the nurses, and can we expect that going forward for the student clinic?
It is to pay the nurses. I believe the student clinic's at the Lord and Taylor site in Stanford, so I don't know if we'd actually have staff there.
Yeah, I would have to check with Alicia whether we are actually staffing that. I'm not sure that we are.
So I would, go ahead, Mrs. Parent.
No, go ahead.
That was Mrs. Ritchie.
All right, Mrs. Ritchie, go ahead.
Just following up on that, could we just have more detail? It seemed, I guess, correct me if I'm wrong, we had 2 days of clinics for the staff, 1 for the first dose, 1 for the second dose. Is that correct?
That's correct. Yes.
And I'm curious, is it typical? I don't know how it works with the town side. So are they typically volunteers when it's just the town clinic? And for the school clinics, for the teachers, we paid staff to come in. Is that correct?
We have to pay the nurses to run the clinic and administer the shots.
Right. So that's different than how the town runs the clinic. So was this a town run clinic or was it a district run clinic? I'm a little confused.
Well, I would characterize it as a time run clinic for our staff. I mean, given the pandemic nature, the first selectman has indicated their willingness to pay if we needed them to pay for this. So that's a decision we just need to make, whether it's we show it as we're showing it here, or we're seeking some sort of a reimbursement.
Well, I mean, honestly, this is a transfer, correct? So honestly, it's sort of a little cart before the horse, because we've clearly already had these clinics, so those expenses are sitting out there. And I'm fine paying for the expenses. I don't think that's a problem. I wanted to get more clarity on how the clinic was being run. If it was being run by the district, if it was being run by the town, if the town is charging us the $11,000, or how logistically that's working.
So since there are employees, we do have to run them through our payroll so that it's their W-2. So it's a payroll expense for the Board of Ed.
Okay, I have some questions in there though. Mr. Sini, was that your hand raised? I couldn't tell. I can only see your shoulder. Was your hand raised?
Can we get the presentation off so we can see all of us at once so we can raise our hand? I can't see myself even.
Oh,
okay, great. Okay. Thank you. I was just in a comment. Why don't you guys go down the line of the questioning, because I have a different line of questioning if you're going to focus on the clinic stuff. Okay,
I do have a question on the clinic. I think Mrs. Ritchie's question is a good one, and it's very unclear to me. It would seem to me that this is if we are paying for it and looking at a transfer of $11,000, this is a district clinic. While I'm happy we did it, I did ask in February to be kept abreast of these expenses. So it's a little hard to see them now. Certainly, I think the health department has done an amazing job coordinating with Alicia to get this done. So I don't think anyone is looking at the end result. Or I won't want to speak for Mrs. Ritchie or Mrs. Parent, whose questions we're happy with the end result, but we're trying to follow the money just so we know and can make informed transfers. So Dr. Adley, then when you say, well, the town is willing to pay, what are you asking this finance committee to consider? Because we need to go to the Board of Education and make a recommendation. So if you can just be clear what you're asking us to consider so that we know what we're going forward with, that would be helpful.
I think we're fortunate enough to be able to collaborate around this particular project. I certainly don't want to be dismissive in the sense of saying it's the same path. It's not the same path in that regard. But given the fact we're in a pandemic, I've put it in here. I think that's honestly a board and more political decision than anything else in many ways. So at the board's pleasure as to how I'd like to do it. I would keep it here, but that being said, because it's very transparent as to where it is and where it's coming from, but I understand the question in terms of the technicality of where should it technically reside.
So I don't think anyone is looking to make this a political decision. I think what we're just trying to understand is on the town side, my understanding is all nurses are volunteers. And on the school side, it looks like we paid our employees. And if we promised our employees that we would pay them, then I do think it's our responsibility to do so. And if we can do so within our budget. Again, I'd go back to the original management and setting up these clinics, which is why the board asked to be kept abreast of the situation. That's the confusion. But I don't think this is a political decision at all. I think this is a financial decision. And I just want to know what exactly we're recommending, and also want to thank everyone on both sides, town and school, for making this happen for our teachers. That's where I lie and have a little bit of trouble just understanding this transfer now. This money has been paid out and these employees are expecting or to be paid. So I want to just wrap it up and be done with it. But I do wish we rolled it out slightly different.
Okay, well, I do hope the board didn't feel as if we weren't paying our nurses. I thought we were always on the understanding that we're compensating our nurses for that. But I understand the question from a perspective of how the town run their clinics, the way I respect that.
Does anyone else have questions on this line before we move forward? Or Mrs. Ritchie, do you feel like you had an answer to your question?
I do. I just wanted clarity in terms of how how this was being run through. But again, I echo your comments, Tara. I think it's great that we did this. I'm happy that we offered it. We clearly have the funds available to pay the nurses, and if that's what was decided to do, I'm happy to go ahead and support this transfer. I just needed more clarity on how this had worked. So I'm fine.
Okay, Mrs. Parent?
Sorry, I just think going forward, if we do have to pay our staff for the student clinics, just so we are aware, abreast of that, kept abreast of that before the clinic actually happens. But it sounds like that may not be the case. So
yeah, if we could just confirm what our costs would be going forward to get this done for all our kids over 16. I think my feeling is that the school, it would be best for our school district if we could, but let's just understand whether that's the district or the town is offering that to 16 and up, just so we all understand our responsibilities, which clearly are changing during this COVID environment.
Thank you. Understood. Yep.
Mr. Sini.
My question just, Rich, had to do with the legal expenses and the, they're coming in a bit lower than expected. Could you just comment on that $10,000, why we might be seeing that?
So we do track our legal expenses every month, and we have an assumed forecast of what we'll spend. So while this is the March report, we've actually only been billed through February. The February bill was significantly lower than forecast, and was actually the lowest month of the year. So because of that, we disencumbered that difference in what we would have assumed between for February versus what actually got expended. So that added that extra $10,000 to the pot.
So basically, it's just less activity, conversations, consultations.
Less calls to the attorneys, less need for meetings or things like that would have been billable hours.
Thank you.
Rich, can you talk a little more for us? to have a surplus this large is unusual. Everything about this year is unusual. And quite frankly, an 80% reimbursement from the state is something I at least haven't seen in over a decade. So can you talk a little bit so that we have kind of on the record, I don't want anyone to think that this is an over budgeting situation or that we can sustain $1 million cuts. Can you talk a little bit about the uniqueness of this?
So probably about a third of the surplus relates to excess cost of that 1.1 million. And so typically there's really two reasons why you might get more money in excess cost. The first reason is you spend more money. So if you spend more money and you had more students hit that threshold or exceed that threshold, you're going to get more money back. But there's also somewhat of an offset because your expenses are higher, whether it's tuition or transportation or contract speech or TPP, things like that. That's the more typical reason why you might get more excess cost money. The reason for this year isn't necessarily that we spent more money, it's that the state's reimbursing us more money. That almost never happens. The 80.7 is going to be one of the highest reimbursement rates in a decade for the state of Connecticut. Part of the reason for the higher reimbursement rate is the fact that most schools throughout the state were either closed or hybrid for a good portion of the year. And so their expenditures were much less than anticipated. So districts like Danbury, for example, Bridgeport, Norwalk, Stanford, large districts that might have large expenditures that could be submitted didn't quite have that this year because maybe they didn't have transportation, they weren't open, maybe some of the out-of-district placements were closed, or maybe they didn't have much speech services or OT services because they weren't in school. So when all 169 districts submit to the state, if the submissions are lower and the budget of the state is flat, it's going to drive up that reimbursement rate. And so that's really what we saw this year. In addition to that, roughly a third of that surplus being excess cost, we did have 2 resignations in the curriculum department, which probably were not exactly anticipated. We can probably look at that as a 10% of that surplus. So between just those 2 items right there, we have over 40% of your surplus really from those 2 items. Then the other item is out of district transportation. We are transporting students where their out of district facility is closed or remote. So their savings there, there's no expense associated with that. And then we've had some utility savings, whether it be electricity because the buildings haven't been fully open, diesel fuel savings because we haven't been transporting as many students on as many days. We've had less school days, we've had remote days like this week. So those probably 4 bucket areas represent half of this. All of those items are not typical items that you would see every year. We wouldn't expect to have the buildings closed every year. Since us having less electricity costs, we wouldn't expect not to run buses 180 school days a year, so you wouldn't expect to have that much saving in diesel fuel. We certainly wouldn't expect the state to reimburse us almost 81% for excess costs. And we certainly wouldn't normally expect 2 administrators in 1 department to resign within a year. And so half of that really relates to just those buckets, which are pretty abnormal for the year.
Yeah, I just wanted to stress, look, we would love if the state was back to reimbursing 100% on excess costs as a regular, as the, let's say, algorithm was intended. But this is kind of a number we've never seen before. We would not anticipate that going forward. And, our district is lucky to have been open. It will certainly help to receive these monies, but this is not a matter of us over or under budgeting or not budgeting correctly. This is a situation of, in some ways, found money due to the pandemic. Mr. Cini.
Yeah, and I might even kind of shift your comments in a different way, in that this is net of the $1.7 special appropriation we got from the Board of Finance. If you back out that, we're actually running a deficit of about $550,000 based on all those COVID-related expenses. And that includes a number of grants as well that are probably one-time in nature, or shouldn't be counted on as recurring revenue sources. So I think, net, this was an extraordinarily difficult year, even mid-year, to budget for some of these things in the unknowns. And so that appropriation now in hindsight might seem, too big, but we had no idea what as Rich just talked about, some of these reimbursements would be and what these grants might be. So I echo your thoughts, though. Let's not assume that we can find $1.146 million in every budget.
Yeah, I think Mr. Sini's analysis there is an important one, and I would agree with him to remember that if it weren't for all the grants and appropriations, we would be running in the red. So anyone just tuning into Finance Committee meetings now, I don't know that we can promise you, or nor would we want to be promising you $1 million surpluses in years to come.
But they're nice when they happen.
Sort of.
They are, but it's an anomaly. And I think it's important for us to all recognize that this is, as Mr. Sini has stated, this is an extraordinary year and so much uncertainty, so much unpredictability. And as we go back and look at ECR, I'm actually just flagging it for next year because I think we're going to see a dramatic shift in that as more people are back in school, more services are submitted to the state. I think that we have to be very cautious as we move ahead and you know, just echo the comments of Tara and John. I agree with them.
Okay, so is everyone good if we move along?
I'm sorry, no, I have another question.
This is Richie.
Sorry. I want to go to food services because it's something that's just, it's concerning me because it's usually a self-funding program that we have, and clearly it's struggling right now. And as we just heard Rich state, and we could be looking at another 30 to 35,000 in losses due to school closures. So I just want to touch on that a little bit as we see the fund balance start to creep down, and it's not typical that we have such a low fund balance going into our next fiscal year. So as we see another potential $30,000 to $35,000 hit to that account, Rich, how are we prepared for next year? You did mention some potential transfers. What do we need in that at year end to start up the school year?
So I think ideally we'd like to have about $100,000 in that account, which is where we're at prior to this week right now. So it'll largely depend on how sales look, you know, from this period to the end of June. It might be that we have to make another COVID transfer where we reclassify a portion of expenditures out of the food service account to free up some of that those funds into next year. The reason to have a fund balance in an agency account like this is if, for example, a freezer goes down or something happens where you need an immediate approval, you want to be able to fix it so that you're not halting lunch operations for the students. So if we look around all the districts throughout Connecticut, every district is right now running a deficit in their food service operations. Westport is running about $1 million deficit. New Canaan is running about a $500,000 deficit. Greenwich always runs a deficit in normal years. It's running an even bigger deficit in COVID years. Richfield and Wilton as well. So part of the problem is usually it's self-sustaining because you're relying on sales, lunch sales. With students not in, there's obviously not sales, and we still have some fixed expenditures. We still have our dairy and public school employees. Chartwell's has furloughed employees in order to bring down some of those costs. They've changed some vendors to get more rebates and pass those rebates along to us. But I would think we try to have a target of about $100,000 in fund balance at the end of the year.
Okay. I would imagine as well, there'd be a lot of pre-purchasing as you prepare to start up operations for the new school year. And that would happen prior to any revenues being generated. So that's just something I want to keep an eye on because it's obviously usually something that we don't have to be concerned with. But this year is, again, an aberration. So we just need to keep an eye on that. But so thank you, Rich.
You do see, you know, a drop in revenue in that first beginning of the year as you're buying a lot of food. It tends to go up in that October, November timeframe. It dips a little bit in December and February because you have less service days, and then you see that spike in March, dip in April, and a big spike in May and June.
So, Mr. Rudel, I would just keep an eye. In May and June, we have, at least at our high school, some of that population, at least one grade level, usually out on internships or projects. So you may see some different kinds of dips this year due to that. So if we need to bring a transfer, I guess we'd look to see it in the coming months.
Yep.
Any further questions? Mrs. Ritchie,
I do.
another one.
I'm sorry. I just want to go over to the reconciliations. There just was a couple big ones that I wanted to just get some clarity on. The first one, it seems to be exhaust fan maintenance at Hindley and Holmes, Royal, Oxridge, and Tokenique. Could you just touch on that? And then the other one to touch upon is I see a $20,000, it says additional natural gas expense. Could you just clarify that, please? Thank you.
So for the natural gas expense, homes actually turned to natural gas about midway through the year. It was one of the schools we were waiting on. So that's part of the change there. Some of the change for the exhaust fans, facilities department did have to do some minor repairs on exhaust fans, which is just really routine maintenance. We do have some older exhaust fans in some of the schools like Hindley and Royal and the current Oxbridge. And so there was a need for some additional work just to make sure that they're running smoothly.
Okay, but that was something that was not budgeted.
Correct.
Okay, thank you. That's it.
Mr. Riddle, can I just touch back on ESSER 2? So if you said we're spending most of it now with our requests, so then we are relying on the other federal grants to take us into next year, because if we spend down all of ESSER 2 with this current request, we'll be reliant on the other grant going forward, correct?
That is
For
correct.
anything not in our budget.
Correct.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions? Okay, we'll move on. Do you have anything else on reopening of schools protected expenditures, Mr. Riddle? Agenda item number 2, or are you satisfied there? Okay. Can we walk through the budget transfers, please, for 2020?
No, I'm sorry, Tara. I had something on that item.
Go ahead.
Sorry about that. I wanted to touch on the YMCA. So we're making a transfer for that. So that says to me, we requested a bill and received one from the YMCA, and there was an adjustment.
So we did receive the bill. We haven't paid the bill. We got the bill right before spring break. There were some additional usage for gymnastics primarily, which drove that bill up, and then a little bit for swimming. In total, it was $4,900.
Thanks.
Any other questions? Okay, we will move on to the budget transfers for 2020, 2021, Mr. Riddle.
So the first one is for $11,145, and that is to pay the nursing staff for the COVID vaccine clinic. This money would be coming from savings in diesel fuel. The next is $20,000 custodial overtime, savings coming from diesel fuel. We have had a need to bring in some additional custodial help at the high school and middle school primarily. So these funds would help support that. $2,800 to replace some plexiglass. We just had some of those 4-way plexiglass dividers in the elementary school. Some of them broke, and so we obviously had to get them replaced. And so just a few more funds for that. And then again, $4,940 for YMCA usage, which is for gymnastics and swimming.
Any questions on the transfers? Okay, seeing none, we'll move on. Mr. Riddle, do you expect any other transfers in special education given our closure this week and students receiving services remotely?
Not at this point. We might actually see a little bit more money in things like transportation, but not at this point in terms of transfers.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions? Okay, we'll move forward to the third-party administrators for the 457B plan.
So this is primarily procedural. So the district uses Omni Group to provide its 403B remittance and administration. It does not do that for its 457B plan. It uses the CASBO plan. The CASBO plan does put pretty much all the liability on the district to make sure everything is done correctly, which means then you're bringing in attorneys to make sure if you have a quadro request or a loan request or anything of that nature. So the recommendation is really to combine a third-party administrator for the 403B and 457 with the Omni Group. It is a process that's done in most districts. And then we would just need, because we are removing, we can't use the current plan document from CASBO with the Omni Group. We do need to change the name of the administrator on it from the previous finance director to myself. That way it's a brand new plan document with the Omni Group. We don't have that many people on the 457 plan. We actually have about 4 people who utilize the 457 plan. The majority of employees utilize the 403 bid.
Mr. Rule, how does this affect the contract in any language in notifying the union of the change?
So there's none. Everybody would still have the same access to the current investment providers that they currently do. It's really more of a behind the scenes. It's actually a little bit easier for employees. The Omni Group has an interactive website that allows you to either increase your withholdings, decrease your withholdings. If you want to change your investment provider from, if it's AXA Equitable to Oldham Resources or however it might be, it's actually a lot more user friendly, but there's really no change in benefit to any employee.
And have they been alerted of this intended change?
The employees or?
The employees?
No.
Okay, do you anticipate any concerns?
No.
Any other questions? And this benefits the district in the administration of the overall.
It does. So for example, if you have a qualified domestic relationship order, which is essentially splitting certain assets that an employee might have in a 457, it can be done through Omni Group, which takes kind of the onus off the district and the liability of the district. Currently under the CASBO plan, it is the district's liability and onus to ensure that everything is done properly, that the communications with the two individuals who have that plan and their attorneys are done. It takes that burden off the district and that liability off the district.
And is there any additional cost to the district?
There is not.
Okay. Any other questions?
I think your question about the respective bargaining units did discuss, but just because sometimes in contracts or in policy it does discuss those types of things that they have to be involved in that. That's not the case here, but certainly just as a courtesy to them, I think we would.
No, that's exactly why I was asking. I didn't want to end up back in bargaining for making a change without letting the union know. So if this is exempt from those clauses within the contract, that's fine. But I just wanted to make sure, should they need notification, they had received it. Any other questions before we move on to public comment? Okay, public comment?
Michelle, are you there?
Good morning. Yes, I am. Sorry. Good morning. If there's any public comment, please use the raised hand icon. Once recognized, please state your name and phone number. No, address. Oh, sorry. I'm trying to pull this here. There are no raised hands at this time.
Okay, with that, I'll entertain a motion to adjourn. Mrs. Parent, seconded by Mr. Sini. All in favor? We are adjourned. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you for participating. Thank you very much.